The tech war, it's a war that no country can lose, okay, because it's more important than profits.
The American empire is over. We're done. We peaked about 12, 15 years ago, and we are on a down.
Things like the World Health Organization, the World Trade Organization, all of those are obsolete.
What you're seeing is desperation politics. The whole Trump phenomena. All of these things are signs of what? Of a country that is in trouble and is it turning on its friends because it can to save itself.
There's a monetary order. There is an internal political order. An order is a system of operating. And there's an international geopolitical order. And all of those orders end. And then there's a transition to a new order. And there are 5 forces that drive that over that period of time. Those forces are, there's a debt, money force, economic force. The second is that there's an internal political order. And then that cycle, there's the left and the right. And when it gets to the point where there are irreconcilable differences over money and values, then there is a fight. The third is the geopolitical order. In other words, what are the rules of the world, of how countries interact, and who determines that? There's a change in the world order as rising powers challenge existing declining powers. And so we are seeing that change in the world order from one that was unilaterally, really largely controlled by the United States to something that's very different. The fourth force is climate and acts of nature. Droughts, floods, and pandemics have killed more people than wars. And through history, the fifth force is man's inventiveness, particularly of new technologies. And they interrelate to each other to create big cycles that go from one order to another. And so we are now in that transition to new orders of all of those forms.
If you take the United States together with the other G7 countries, that used to be the dominant bloc of the world, right? The United States, Canada, Japan, Germany, France, Italy, and Britain. And I'm going to add up all the GDP, gross domestic product, total output of goods and services of all of those 7 countries. And now I'm going to compare it to the gross added up GDPs of China and its allies, known now as the BRICS. Okay, you add up the United States, about 28% of world output. You add up China and the BRICS, it's 35% of the world output. We aren't the wealthiest bloc in the world. We're number 2. And that's new. And that changes everything.
We now have a debt issue, a big debt issue globally.
For example, the U.S. budget, about $1 trillion a year now goes to pay interest rates. And over the next year, we're going to have over $9 trillion of debt that we have to pay back and roll forward, hopefully.
So that they have to sell a quantity of debt that the world is not going to want to buy. And that's a set of circumstances that is imminent. Okay, that's paramount importance.
We have the greatest level of corporate debt this country has ever seen, off the chart. The greatest level of personal debt, and we have the greatest level of government debt. Our government debt is now trillions of dollars greater than our annual output. That was not the case in the 20th century. It is the case now. What you're seeing is desperation politics.
Since 1944, there was a healthy period where debt taken on produced enough income to service the debt.
Right.
Then we got into a period of time that more debt got taken on than incomes. And so when you need income to service the debt. And so that rose for a long time. And the crescendo of that took place in the 2 big fiscal stimulations. There were 2 waves. The first wave was the COVID wave, in which the government wanted to deliver a lot more money to people, companies, then there was a loss of income. Then the second, when President Biden was elected, it was mostly like a universal basic income thing. In other words, hand people money and we're going to be better off. Where the government borrowed a lot of money, send out checks, and then we had the rise in inflation.
The United States is the biggest debtor country in the world by countries. The two biggest creditors of the United States government are Japan and China. Japan number one, China number two. A few years ago, it was the other way. China was number one, Japan was number two. The United States owes China $850 billion, roughly. Think of it this way. These kinds of loans from Japan, from China, enable the United States government to spend all the money Dr. Leon told us about in Ukraine without having to tax us. Because you know what would bring the war in Ukraine to an end in about 10, maybe 11 seconds? If Americans had to pay for it. We don't produce the bulk of the world's output. We don't control the bulk of the world's trade. The US dollar, which in 1950s, 60s, 70s was the global currency dominating all others, isn't anymore. So the dollar, from being 70, 80% of the reserves held by central banks, is now about 40%. Still important. We're still a big industrial power, but nothing like we were.
So there's a big cycle of increasing debt relative to incomes. Until you can't do that anymore, you are going to see shocking developments. There may be exerting pressures on countries to own the debt, to buy the debt, political pressures on countries. There may be cutting the payments to some creditor countries off for political reasons and so on.
Right. In recent days, we have seen the decision of the Trump administration to kiss the war in Ukraine goodbye. We're not doing that no more because we can't afford it. We can't keep funding a war, which, by the way, the West is losing, as anybody who pays attention knows. All of these things are signs of what? Of a country that is in trouble and is turning on its friends because it can to save itself. If you study colonialism, you discover that most of the time, when a country began going overseas and snatching parts of the world, it was because of two things. One, it needed to, and two, it could. The United States needs it, and the United States can. It can't take over Europe. It's too expensive, too difficult. They're too rich, and they're too powerful. And they can't control Russia. They are learning that now. Oh, yeah. And they can't control China. They've learned that now for 25 years. But what can they control? They can control Mexico. They can control Canada. Or at least they can make a stab at it. $1 out of $5 worth of food that you and I and everybody eats comes from overseas, and most of that from Mexico and Canada. Energy comes. A huge portion of our energy is Canadian, oil, gas, and so on. So these are basic things we need, and we're strong enough. They depend on us way more than we depend on them. We're a much bigger economy than either of them. So we can.
The solution is you must cut the deficit down to 3% of GDP. The United States will run a deficit of about 7.5% of GDP if the Trump tax cuts are continued, which I expect. And that deficit needs to be cut to 3% of GDP, must be cut to 3% of GDP. We can do this, and if we don't do this, the power of the United States is going to be greatly diminished.
I'm a professor of economics. I've studied it all my life. What you're saying is a nice way, better way than they usually do, for what used to be called trickle-down economics. You help the folks at the top, you boost the profits, you give them a tax cut, and it'll trickle down to a good job for me and all that. There was, I'm going to be more nice now than I ought to be, there was a grain of truth to that, but it isn't anymore. The American empire is over. We're done. We peaked about 12, 15 years ago, and we are on a down. And it's very hard for the American people, which I understand. I am one. It's hard to get your head around that. We've had a century of on the way up, which is a lot more fun than on the way down. But it does happen to every empire. We're only the latest. Look at the British, how far they've fallen. We're in that process. So the problem with the trickle down is, yeah, there might be more jobs, but they're going to be created in China. They're going to be created in Brazil. They're going to be created in India. They're not created here.
So now the question is, are the cost cuts going to actually be able to produce that? You have to take sharp pencils, and you also have to think, what are you going to break along the way? Because you don't want to break too many things along the way, but you've got to do it fast. And you look at government expenditures, roughly 70% of government expenditures you can't cut. So,
Right.
So it comes down to a small percentage that you can cut. Think of the timeline as this way. There's the first 100 days. We're in a honeymoon period. I'm old, I've been through this a long time. There's 100 days that you can change legislation. You move quickly and everybody's there. Then there's the next important time horizon is 2 years to the midterm elections. There could be a lot of fighting in the midterm elections. I think as we step back, the important thing is that we don't just react to how we feel. Like we feel good in the moment right now.
Tariffs are paid by Americans to the American government. Tariffs are a tax. They just it's a tax on imports to which we have given historically a particular name, tariff.
So tariffs are going to cause fighting between countries. I'm not, what type of fighting? I'm not going to, maybe it's military, but I'm not necessarily talking about military. But think about US, Canada, Mexico, China, and all of those types of fighting. There will be fighting, and that will have consequences.
It means we will have to pay more for everything you attach a tariff to. Let me give you a simple example. The best electric vehicles in the world right now, but by uniform global agreement, are produced by something called the BYD Corporation, which is Chinese. They make the best quality, cheapest electric car and truck. All right. You don't see them anywhere in the United States. Why not? Because Mr. Trump put a 27% tariff on them, and Mr. Biden raised it to 100%. So let me give you an example. If you wanted to buy a $30,000 BYD electric vehicle, which you could do, that's what they charge. That's why it's so good. You would have to pay $30,000 to get the Chinese to ship it here. Then you'd have to give another $30,000, 100%, tariff to Uncle Sam, or in this case, Uncle Don. So it would cost you $60,000, which you're not going to do because you can get a less good Tesla or GM or Ford or anybody else at $40,000 to $50,000. That's good for the Tesla company, GM and Ford and the others. Good. And they'll maybe be able to hold on to some jobs. Good. But now let's follow the bouncing ball. Everywhere else in the world, every company in Asia, Africa, Latin America that competes with an American company that has to buy a truck as part of its business will go to China and buy the best truck at the lowest price, $30,000, the best truck. No American company that competes with them will do that. And you know what that means? Those companies will be able to charge a lower price because they have better inputs than the American company, which doesn't. In the long run, that will lose Americans' jobs left and right as they're outcompeted by all the rest of the world that can go and buy, and is buying, BYD trucks.
The tech war, the AI war, it's a war that no country can lose. Okay, because it's more important than profits. Like, I think the Chinese are a bit behind in the chips, but they're ahead in the applications. Well, the Chinese play is going to be chips, very inexpensive chips embedded into manufactured goods. You'll see robotics. So you're going to see Chinese are unbelievably in making things inexpensively, terrifically. They own 33% of all world manufactured goods, which is more than the combined U.S., German, and Japanese manufactured goods. Chinese produce more. So,
Well, the United States is uniquely competitive in inventing the best chips. It's not uniquely competitive, it's uniquely uncompetitive in producing them. China is behind, but not by a lot, in the best chips, and they try to get the best chips. But they're ahead in making more chips and having those chips work together in applications. And they're integrating chips with robotics. So, and way ahead on that. So the application and the usage, I mean, there's going to be a big competition, but that's what it really looks like today.
Economically, the game is over. The Chinese, if not already a wealthier economic unit than we are, which they probably are, will be within a few years. Very few, like by the end of this decade, if not already. So economically, they are now our equal. But remember, they're our equal. They're going up. We're going down. We're equal, but the trajectory is unmistakable across the board. But militarily, there's none of that. Americans have to understand, even if you don't agree with me, try to understand how the rest of the world looks at it. The United States maintains 750 military bases around the world. China doesn't have any. The United States is a global military presence, the likes of which is not existing anywhere. We are alone in that.
internationally, you are going to have the same kind of conflict. We touched on China. We're going to have conflict. You no longer have a cooperative, even an attempt at a cooperative world order. Things like the World Health Organization, the World Trade Organization, all of those are obsolete. And so we're going to have, again, might is right. And so it's going to be a period of greater conflict. You're going to have a technology war. You can have increased military spending in this kind of environment. That creates a budget issue. And climate will have, it will be an economic issue as well as a environmental issue.
I put it this way. I think you're at a crossroads now. Either you decide to stay with what you're doing, in which case you're right. They will develop a military capability because that will be their only safety for them. Forget whether you agree with them or not. It's not the issue. But there's an alternative. The alternative is you sit down and you say to your adversary, we both got to live on this planet. Can we work out a deal where we give each other the room to function, to live? Because if we threaten each other, what's the end game of this? We spend a fortune fighting. If we ever slip and make a nuclear war, it's over anyway. I think I'm the patriot saying to America, to save the good things about the society, let's sit down and work.
I think we are in an era that, of course, we're going to have great conflict in the United States. This is not a run to nirvana. You're going to have legal challenges, the blue states, the red states, and within the states, you're going to have a lot of disruption and you're going to have a lot of dissatisfaction, and it's going to be about money and power. There's the socialists, the left, the right, and that's why this type of civil war or internal conflict is going to be with us. This is not a straight race to nirvana and prosperity.
In a country of 330 million people, 1%, 3 million people are responsible for most of the changes, if you were to look at that. They are the ones who go to the great universities and they're innovators and they make the unicorns and so on. Then the other top 10% is those around them who then do well. That next 30% is doing okay, and the bottom 60% has a reading level that's below sixth grade and is not productive. There are many unproductive people, and because they're unproductive, then they don't have the incomes and so on, and we have an issue. And that big social issue is important.
There is then greater and greater gaps and conflict between the left and the right, and populism that forces a great conflict like a civil war.
The general belief of the Chinese on the art of war is that if you're going into a fighting war, you must not have been smart enough to win without a fighting war. And you win through deception and manipulation, because fighting wars are going to damage you a lot. You don't want to be damaged. You want to get to your objective. So it sounds like a smart way to fight wars. Also, international relations, there's what's called the tribute system. And the tribute system was your power determines where you are in your hierarchy. If you have more power, you have more hierarchy. You're higher in the hierarchy. It's like Confucian. And if you are, and everybody should know what each other's power is, and the lesser power should give tribute to the greater power. This is internationally. And the greater power should respect that and treat, and they should work and have harmony together rather than to have the conflict. Because it's all about getting what you want. Harmony and prosperity is what you want, and fighting that destroys things is not what you want.